The first time Nora Alden saw Lionel Holloway's handwriting, she thought a spider had walked through an inkwell and staggered across the page. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell Crossing, Kansas, had seen better days and worse ones, though lately the scales had been tipping hard toward the worse. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, which should have meant prosperity, but prosperity had a way of sliding past small towns the way a creek slides around a stubborn rock. You could feel the current, but you never quite got wet. The cattle drive still came through, and the saloon still did its brisk and graceless business, and the general store that Nora ran with the careful precision of a woman who understood that every penny was a conversation with survival, kept its shelves stocked and its accounts as clean as she could manage. She was 26 years old, with hair the color of dark honey pinned back in a way that never quite held through the afternoon, and eyes that her mother had once called trouble-colored, meaning they were the sort of deep brown that made people want to say things they had not planned on saying. She had come to Caldwell Crossing 4 years ago from St. Louis, not running from anything exactly, but walking very deliberately towards something she could not yet name. She had bought half the general store from old Clement Price when his rheumatism had made the books impossible for him to manage, and she had turned that half into a whole when Clement passed the following winter, leaving no heirs and a modest debt that she had settled with the county clerk with the last of her savings. She was the only woman in Caldwell County who ran her own business, which earned her some admiration, some suspicion, and a great deal of unsolicited advice, all of which she received with the same polite and absolute indifference. She was also, as it turned out, the only woman in the county who could read Lionel Holloway's handwriting, though she did not know that yet on the morning the man himself walked through her door. He was tall in a way that seemed almost accidental, as though he had not meant to take up quite so much vertical space, but had arrived at it anyway. His hat was pushed back from his forehead, and there was trailed dust on his coat and on his boots, and on the general outline of him that suggested he had been riding for several days without much thought given to appearances. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that had not met a razor recently and hands that were calloused and capable-looking. He carried himself with the particular quietness of a man who had learned that the world was loud enough without his contribution. He set a folded piece of paper on the counter without preamble and said, "I need these supplies. I can pay." Nora looked at the paper. She looked at it for a longer moment than was strictly polite. The handwriting was extraordinary in its complete disregard for any convention she had ever been taught. The letters were enormous in some places and nearly microscopic in others. Certain words leaned sharply to the left while others launched themselves skyward at impossible angles. There were loops where there should have been points and points where there should have been loops, and at least 2 letters that she was fairly certain he had invented himself. "I will need a moment," she said. "Take your time," he said, and leaned against the counter in a way that suggested he had all of it. She moved the paper closer to the light from the window. She tilted it slightly. She had grown up in a household with a father who was a physician, and his medical shorthand had been similarly lawless, which had given her an early education in the archaeology of difficult script. She had learned to read him not letter by letter but word by word, the way you read a map by landmark rather than measurement. "Flour," she said slowly, beginning to decode it. "Salt pork, coffee 2 pounds, nails 1 box, lamp oil." She looked up. "Is that last word wire or wine?" "Wire," he said. "Fence wire if you have it." "I have it." She set the paper down. "That will be $2.40 for everything on this list." He reached into his coat pocket and produced the money without counting it, which told her he had already counted it somewhere else, which told her he was careful with what he had. She began to gather the items, moving through the store with the efficiency of someone who knew where everything lived, and he watched her with the same quiet attention he seemed to give to everything. "You're new to the county," she said. It was not exactly a question. "Took a place out on the Brennan Creek Road," he said. The old Whitfield land. She knew it. Everyone knew it. The Whitfield land had been empty for 2 years since Harlan Whitfield had lost it to taxes and left for Colorado with his family and a look of specific defeat. The property was 200 acres of grass and possibility, with a creek running through the north quarter and a house that needed work but was not beyond saving. Lionel Holloway, he said, because she had not asked, but he seemed to understand that she was going to. Nora Alden, she said, I own this store. I know, he said. I was told to come here first. Who told you? Man named Reardon at the livery. Said you ran the most honest establishment in the county and that your prices were fair. Nora felt something warm move briefly through her chest. Tom Reardon was not a man given to compliments, which made the ones he gave worth something. Mr. Reardon is generous, she said. Seemed practical to me, Lionel said. She packed his supplies into a crate and he carried it out to his wagon without asking for help, which she appreciated because she was tired of men asking if she needed help when they were the ones accepting assistance. He loaded it in the wagon bed, then came back to the door, and she thought for a moment he had forgotten something, but he just stood there in the frame of light and said, "Thank you, Miss Alden." "Mrs.," she said, and then immediately corrected herself. "It was Mrs., it is Miss now. My husband passed 2 years ago." She did not know why she had said it. She almost never said it. "I'm sorry," he said, and the way he said it was not the performance of condolence she had grown accustomed to. It sounded like he simply was. He touched the brim of his hat and went back to his wagon, and she watched him drive away down the main street of Caldwell Crossing and felt the particular unsettled feeling of something that has begun without your permission. The second time he came to the store was 10 days later. He had another list, written in the same magnificent chaos of handwriting, and this time she took it without comment and read it more quickly, because she had been thinking about it since the first time, turning the shapes of his letters over in her mind the way you turn a key when you are still learning a lock. She recognized now that what looked like illegibility was actually a very particular system. He wrote fast and he wrote with pressure, which meant his letters compressed and merged in ways that were predictable once you knew the pattern. "You read it faster this time," he said. "I have been practicing," she said, and then felt color come into her face because that sounded like she had been thinking about him, which she had been, though she had been telling herself she was simply thinking about the puzzle of the handwriting. He looked at her with something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was closely related to one. "I had a schoolteacher once who used to make me write my letters over until my hand ached," he said. "It never helped." "It never would have," Nora said, examining the list more carefully. "Your handwriting is not a lack of practice. It is entirely its own thing. You have a system." "I am glad someone can see that," he said. "The postmaster in Abilene once refused to send a letter of mine, said he could not confirm it was English." She laughed before she meant to. It came out bright and quick, and it surprised her enough that she pressed her lips together afterward, as though she could take it back. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression shifted and settled, like a door that had been open a crack being opened all the way. He bought his supplies and she packed them and he loaded them, and before he drove away he said, "Miss Alden, would you know if there is anyone in town who does carpentry work? The house needs its porch rebuilt before winter." "Ezra Marsh does good work," she said. "Is on the west end of Birch Street. Tell him I sent you and he will give you a fair price." "Thank you," he said. He paused. "I don't know many people here yet." "You will," she said. "It is a small county. Everyone knows everything about everyone inside of a month." "What do they know about you?" he asked, and it came out direct and genuine, not flirtatious exactly, but interested. Like a man asking a question he actually wanted the answer to. She considered it. "That I came from St. Louis. That I am a widow. That I keep good accounts and do not extend credit to men who drink too much. That I read everything I can get my hands on and that I have opinions about most of it." He nodded slowly. "That seems like a reasonable picture." "It is incomplete," she said. "It always is," he said. He drove away again, and this time she stood at the window for a full minute watching the dust settle after his wagon. The autumn deepened, and he came to the store regularly now, every 10 days or so, and each time there was a list, and each time she read it with increasing ease, and each time they talked a little more and a little longer. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that he had served 2 years in the Army after the war, not in the war itself, which he would have been too young for, but in the aftermath, doing garrison duty in the Reconstruction South, which had given him a complicated and carefully considered relationship with the subject of justice and its frequent absence. She learned that he had worked cattle drives for 6 years, riding for 3 different outfits, and that he had saved his money with a discipline that the other cowboys had thought peculiar, and which had eventually given him enough to buy the Whitfield land. She learned that he had a dog named Prospector, a brown and white hound of uncertain ancestry, who accompanied him to town and waited in the wagon with the patience of a saint. She told him things, too, more than she intended, and always with a slight surprise at herself. She told him about her father's medical practice, and about the books she had grown up reading, the medical texts mixed in with the novels and the history and the agricultural pamphlets, a library that had not organized itself by subject so much as by whatever her father had happened to carry home. She told him about her husband, James Alden, who had been a good man and a kind one, and who had died of a fever that came on fast and took him in 4 days, and how the grief had been real and complete, and how she had learned, eventually, that real and complete grief was also something you could survive and carry and go on with. She did not tell him that she had been lonely in a specific way since James died, not the loneliness of solitude, which she had made her peace with, but the loneliness of having no one to think alongside. She was thinking alongside Lionel Holloway before she fully acknowledged that was what she was doing. It was November when things shifted. He came to the store on a Wednesday, which was unusual because he usually came on Fridays or Saturdays, and he came without a list, which was also unusual, and he looked like he had been working without pause for days, which was probably accurate given the time of year and all the work the property still needed. "I have a letter," he said. "I need it read." She looked at him. "Who is the letter from?" "My uncle in Nashville. He writes to me every few months." He took it from his coat pocket. It was sealed and addressed in a different hand from his, and for a moment she did not understand. Then she did. "Your uncle's handwriting is also difficult," she said. "Worse than mine," Lionel said. "My grandmother, who raised both of us, had a theory that it was inherited on the male side. She wrote like a schoolteacher herself, very fine and clear. She thought it skipped the women." Nora took the letter and opened it carefully, and the handwriting inside was indeed spectacular in its illegibility, though in a different direction from Lionel's. Where his was compressed and angular, his uncle's spread out enormously, with letters that took up 3 times the space they needed, and a general attitude of having been written in a moving vehicle during a storm. She read it aloud slowly, working through it. The uncle, a man named William Holloway, wrote about the family property, and about a cousin who had married, and about a local election, and about some medical trouble with his knee that he was treating with various remedies of questionable validity. He ended by saying he hoped Lionel had found what he was looking for out west, and that the family thought about him often, and that his grandmother's rocking chair was waiting for him if he ever came home. When Nora finished reading, there was a silence. "He seems well," she said. "He does," Lionel said. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't had that letter read in 6 weeks. I kept meaning to find someone." "Why me?" she asked. "Tom Reardon told me you were the only person in the county who could read my supply lists," he said. "I figured if you could read mine, you might manage his." "He was right," she said, "and I could." She folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "Do you want to write him back? I can help with that too if he finds reading as difficult as writing." Lionel looked at her steadily. "He does," he said. "He would appreciate it." "Then come back on Saturday," she said. "I close at 4 o'clock, but I stay in the back going over the accounts until 6. You can dictate, and I will write it out clearly." He came back on Saturday. He sat across from her at the small table she used for her accounting work, and she had paper and ink ready, and he dictated a letter to his uncle that was warm and specific and full of detail about the land and the work, and the way the Kansas sky looked different from Tennessee sky, broader and less interrupted, and she wrote it out in her own clear, even hand while he talked. When he paused to think, she waited without filling the silence with anything, which he seemed to appreciate. When the letter was finished, he read over her transcription, moving through it carefully. "You kept everything," he said. "It was your letter," she said. "I am only the instrument." "You are more than that," he said, and looked up from the page. The lamp between them threw light across both their faces, and outside the wind was doing what November winds in Kansas do, which is to say it was making the world feel very small and the indoors feel very necessary. "I should not keep you," he said, but did not move. "I was not going anywhere," she said. He stayed another hour, and they talked about his uncle and about Tennessee, and about the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being far from the people who knew you when you were young. She made coffee on the small stove she kept in the back room, and they drank it with the natural ease of people who have been sharing small domestic moments for much longer than they actually have. And when he finally stood to leave, he stood slowly, as though the leaving required more effort than the staying. "Saturday is a good day," he said at the door. "It is," she agreed. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. By December, they had established something that neither of them had named, but both of them knew was a fixture of their respective weeks. He would come in the late afternoon after she closed the store, and she would make coffee, and they would write a letter or read something together or simply talk while the winter settled outside the windows. He had begun to read her books, borrowing them from the small shelf she kept in the back room. He returned them with observations tucked inside, not notes exactly, because a note was a formal thing, but marginal comments written in his extraordinary handwriting on small slips of paper he left between the pages. She could read them now with almost no difficulty, and she read each one twice, once to understand and once to consider. One evening in December, she was going through a crate of supplies that had come on the stage from Wichita, checking items against her order, when she found the inventory list she had asked Lionel to write out for her 2 weeks prior when she had needed a record of the fence wire he had ordered through her. She had given him a blank sheet, and he had written the list and given it back, and she had filed it without looking closely. She looked closely now. In the margins of the list, in every margin, top and bottom and both sides, he had written her name, Nora. Not once or twice, but many times in the same restless, angular hand, some small and some large, some careful and some dashed off, but always the same word. Her name. Filling every available space around the edges of the inventory he had been asked to compile, as though the list were an interruption, and the margins were where his mind was actually located. She held the paper for a long time. She was not embarrassed exactly. She was something else, something warmer and more complicated, something that had been building in her for 2 months and had not yet found a name for itself. She was also, in the privacy of her own honesty, unsurprised. She had been writing his name too, though not on paper. She had been writing it in the more invisible margins of her thoughts, in the white space around the practical tasks of her days, and she had been telling herself it was simply familiarity and was now forced to acknowledge it was something else entirely. She set the paper aside carefully. She did not put it back in the crate. She put it on the small shelf with her books. Saturday came. He arrived at 4:15, as he usually did, and she had coffee made, and she was sitting at the table not pretending to do accounts, because she had decided that honesty was a better strategy for what she was planning to do. She had the inventory list in front of her when he came in. He looked at it before he even sat down, and she watched him do the calculation of what she knew. "I should explain that," he said. "I would like you to," she said, "though I have a theory." He sat down. He put his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair, which was a thing he did when he was thinking. "What is your theory?" he asked. "That you have been thinking about me," she said. "In the same way I have been thinking about you." In the margins of things, he looked at her. The lamp was between them again, and the wind outside was the same relentless December wind, and she thought that this was exactly the kind of moment she had stopped expecting and had very much wanted. "Nora," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been considerably more careful than I apparently appeared," he said. "You are a widow and a woman who runs her own business, and I did not want to presume anything. But every time I leave here I think about you the whole way home, and I cannot seem to stop writing your name. I know the feeling," she said, "the specific version of it where you are not sure when it started. October," he said, "when you laughed at the postmaster's story." "I closed the store 20 minutes early on the Friday I thought you might be coming," she said, "because I wanted the extra time. That was also October." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and the warmth of it moved through her like the first light through a window in the morning, and she turned her hand over so their palms were together. "I do not know what I am doing," he said. "I am a man with a partially built fence and a dog and a house that still needs its kitchen ceiling repaired. I have a store and 2 cats who do not get along, and a shelf full of books with your opinions in the margins," she said. He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and it changed his face in a way she had been waiting to see since October. "That is a list of assets," he said. "I thought so too," she said. He did not kiss her that evening. He held her hand across the table for a long time, and they talked and drank coffee, and the wind outside said nothing worth listening to, and when he finally left he held her hand a moment longer at the door before he went to his wagon. Prospector the dog looked at her from the wagon seat with an expression of canine assessment and apparently found her satisfactory, because he turned around twice and lay down. "Good night, Nora," Lionel said. "Good night, Lionel," she said. She stood in the doorway of her store until she could no longer hear the wagon wheels, and then she went inside and looked at the inventory list on the shelf for a while, all her name written around the edges of it, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was a sense of the future being an interesting place to be going. Christmas came to Caldwell Crossing in the way it came to most small Kansas towns in 1878, which was to say with great effort on the part of a few, and with the saloon doing its best business of the year, and with children making the most noise in the general store as they pressed their faces against the glass cases where the candy was kept. Nora had ordered extra peppermint sticks and had decorated the window with the small painted paper ornaments she unpacked every year from a box that had come with her from St. Louis. And the store was warm with the good smell of pine and coffee and the faint underlying sugar smell of the candy. Lionel came in on the 23rd, and she was busy with customers, which was unusual enough that she sometimes felt she was playing the role of a busy shopkeeper rather than being one. He waited, patient as always, perusing the shelves with the unhurried attention of a man in no hurry until the store cleared. "I have something for you," he said. He set a wrapped package on the counter. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, and it was the shape of a book. She opened it carefully. It was a book, as she had suspected, but not any book she had seen before. It was a leather journal, well made and thick, with her initials stamped on the front cover. N.A. She opened it. The inside front cover had writing in it, his handwriting, and she read it without difficulty now, as easily as she read her own. He had written, for the woman who could read what no one else could, "May you always find words worth reading." She looked up from it, and he was watching her with the careful attention he gave everything, though there was something else in it now, something that had been there since she had found the inventory list and named it aloud. "Lionel," she said. "Yes," he said. "This is the most thoughtful gift I have received in a very long time," she said. "I have a second gift," he said, "but that one requires that you come outside." She put her coat on, and they went out onto the porch of the store, and he pointed up the main street to where the cottonwood tree that stood at the intersection of Main and River Streets had been hung with a small lantern that someone had put there, one of the Christmas lanterns that the town committee put up each year, and it was swinging in the cold wind and throwing its small gold light across the packed snow in the street. "That is not your gift," he said. "I just wanted you to see it." She laughed. "Then what is the gift?" He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small folded paper. She took it and opened it. It was a list, one of his lists, written in his unmistakable hand, but it was not a supply list. It was a list of things he had been thinking about, written out in his private shorthand, each item a sentence or a question. She read through them slowly, her breath making small clouds in the cold December air. The first item said, whether she knows that the best part of every week is Saturday afternoon. The second said, whether a man who is still building his fence has any business asking what he wants to ask. The third said, whether the fact that she laughed at the postmaster's story means what he thinks it means. She folded the paper slowly and looked at him. He was watching her with a combination of hope and composure that struck her as deeply characteristic. "The answer to all three is yes," she said. He stepped forward and kissed her, there on the porch of her store, in the cold December air with the Christmas lantern swinging in the cottonwood, and the small town of Caldwell Crossing carrying on its practical business around them. It was a careful kiss and then a less careful one, and she put her hand against his cold cheek and felt something settle in her, with a solidity that she had been waiting for without knowing exactly what shape it would take when it arrived. "Merry Christmas, Nora," he said against her hair. "Merry Christmas, Lionel," she said. January in Kansas was a particular kind of test, the kind that asked whether you were serious about your decisions or whether you had simply been carried away by December sentiment. The cold came in hard and stayed, and the roads between town and the outlying properties were sometimes impassable for days at a time, and the world contracted to whatever you could reach on foot. During those contracted days, Nora found that what she missed was specific and clear. She missed his particular quietness. She missed the way he listened, which was with his whole attention. She missed the conversations that started as one thing and arrived as something else entirely, the way a road that starts flat will eventually reveal hills. He appeared on a Tuesday in the middle of January, having come in on the stage road which was more passable than the creek road, and he was snow-covered and cold, and he came into the store and stood at the counter, and she was simply glad to see him in a way that was past the point of managing. "You are going to get yourself killed coming in during weather like this," she said, which was not what she had intended to say. "I brought the letters," he said. He had two of them, from his uncle and also from his cousin in Nashville, whose handwriting, he said, was the middle ground between his and his uncle's, which she discovered was accurate. She read them both, sitting at the counter while he drank the coffee she had made and let the warmth come back into his hands. The letters were full of family news and family warmth, and reading them she felt something for which she did not quite have a word. Not jealousy of the family he had and she did not. Something more like wistfulness, or perhaps recognition. She had her own people in St. Louis, a sister and two nieces, and she wrote to them regularly, but the distance was enormous and the letters took weeks and the space between writing and receiving was sometimes hard. "Do you miss them?" she asked when she had finished reading. "My family," he considered it. "I miss knowing they are there. I do not miss being there. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said. "I feel the same about St. Louis." "But you built something here," he said. "So have you," she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup with the direct gaze she had learned was his version of saying something significant. "I would like to build more of it," he said. She did not pretend not to understand him. "Tell me what you mean," she said, "specifically." "I mean that when the road is impassable I want to be closer to you," he said. "I mean that I have been thinking about the future in a way I have not thought about it in a long time, and you are in every version of it." He paused. "I mean that I would like to court you properly, with the intention of asking you to marry me, and I want to know if that is something you would consider." The store was very quiet around them. Outside, the January wind spoke its single-note argument against the windows. "Lionel," she said. "I know it is fast," he said. "I know you have been independent and your own person, and I would not ask you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I am not asking you to give up the store or any of it. I am asking if there is room in the life you have built for the life I would like to build alongside it." She thought about the list he had written in December, the questions that had been answers before she read them. She thought about the inventory list with her name in every margin, which was still on her shelf between her books, and which she had looked at more times than she could count. She thought about the sensation she had when she saw him come through the door, which was not the gentle warmth of friendship but something considerably brighter and more pressing. "I will not say yes to the proposal today," she said, "because I think you should ask me properly when you are ready, and I would like to receive it properly. But I am telling you now that the answer will be yes." He set his coffee cup down and he came around the counter and he kissed her again, warm this time, in the warm store with the cold shut out behind the glass, and she held on to him and thought that this was what she had come to Kansas looking for, the thing she had been walking toward without knowing its name. "You are remarkable," he said. "I know," she said. He laughed, and it was a real laugh, full and easy, and she thought she had been waiting to hear that particular sound for most of her adult life. The winter passed in the way that good winters do when you have something warm to hold in mind, slowly and not without hardship, but with a quality of expectation that made the cold bearable and the isolation temporary. Nora found herself writing in the journal he had given her, not diary entries exactly but observations, things she noticed and wanted to keep. She found herself writing his name in the margins too, without meaning to, the way you hum a song without hearing it, and she thought that this was something she would tell him someday, and that he would find it funny and meaningful in equal measure. He came to Sunday services at the small Methodist church that Caldwell Crossing maintained with the same practical determination it applied to everything, and he sat in the pew 2 rows behind hers, and she was aware of him with the specific peripheral awareness of someone whose presence you have started to require. After services, it became their habit to walk down to the creek, which was frozen in January but began to show signs of life in February, and to talk for an hour before she went back to prepare the store for Monday, and he made the drive back to his property. It was on one of these walks, in late February when the creek was beginning to run in its center though the edges were still ice-edged, that she told him about James. Not the facts of him, she had told him those already, but the shape of the marriage, the particular texture of it. James had been a clerk for the railroad, a steady and responsible man who had loved her, and whom she had loved, not with the intensity she was coming to understand was possible, but with the genuine settled warmth of two people who were well-suited and who tried. He had died at 30, of a fever that the doctor had not been able to name with certainty, and she had mourned him truly and had come to Kansas 6 months later because she needed to build something with her own hands, and she could not do that in the city where everything was already built. "I loved him," she said. "I want you to know that I did. What I have with you is not a replacement for what I had with him. It is entirely different. It is more." Lionel listened to this in the way he listened to everything completely, and then he said, "Thank you for telling me that." "Does it trouble you?" she asked. "No," he said. "You are 26. Of course you have a history, so do I." He paused. "Do you want to know about mine?" "If you want to tell me," she said. He had been engaged once in Tennessee at the age of 22 to a woman named Catherine who had been the daughter of a neighboring family. They had been engaged for a year, and then she had married someone else, which had been her right and which he had understood even while it had hurt him considerably. He had left Tennessee shortly after, and the cattle drives and then the property had been, in some way, the building of a life that did not depend on anyone else staying. "Until you," he said. "Until me," she agreed. He kissed her on the bank of Brennan Creek, while the ice at the edges made its small crackling sounds, and the first brave suggestion of spring light came off the water. And she thought that all of it, James and Catherine, and the roads both of them had taken to this particular place, had a logic to it that she could not have understood from the beginning but could see clearly now. March came and the county began its annual contest with mud, which it always lost, the roads becoming indistinguishable from the fields, and the fields becoming indistinguishable from the creek, and everything temporarily returning to a state of prehistoric formlessness that the residents of Caldwell County accepted with the philosophical resignation of people who had been through it before. It was during this muddy interlude that Nora had her first significant trouble with a man named Garrett Peel. Garrett Peel was the kind of man who existed in every small western town in those years, a man of middle age and middling prospects who had decided that his particular failures were the fault of women who would not cooperate with his vision of the world, and who expressed this grievance most clearly in the presence of a woman who was doing well without him. He had been buying supplies at the store for 2 years and paying his accounts on time, which had kept their relationship functional. But in March, he came in 3 times in 1 week, and on the 3rd visit he told Nora that she was running the store wrong and that she should consider taking on a partner, by which he meant himself. She told him clearly that she was not interested in a partner. He came back the following week and said it again, this time with less politeness and more of the underlying tone that some men used when they meant to suggest that what a woman had was not really hers to refuse. She told him clearly again. He came back a 3rd time on a Friday when the store was busy, and he said, in a voice that was calibrated to be heard, that it was a shame what happened to businesses run by women alone, that they tended to fail for lack of proper management, and that he was simply trying to help. Nora had been running a business since she was 22. She had kept her books in the black through 2 Kansas winters and a drought. She looked at Garrett Peel across her counter with the complete calm of a woman who is not afraid and said, "Mr. Peel, your account is current, and you are welcome to shop here as a customer. If you speak to me that way again, I will close your account and you will need to order your supplies from Hays City, which is a significant inconvenience. I suggest you consider whether you want to continue this conversation." He left, but not without a look that she filed away in the part of her mind that kept track of things to be careful about. She mentioned it to Lionel on Saturday, not because she needed him to solve it, but because she was in the habit of telling him things. "I know Peel," he said. His voice was quiet in the particular way it got when something mattered to him. "I have seen him in the saloon. He is the kind of man who does not take limits well. He will take mine," she said. "I have managed worse." "I know you have," Lionel said. He was quiet for a moment. "Will you tell me if it gets worse?" "Yes," she said. "But I am also capable of handling it." "I know that too," he said. Both things can be true. She thought about that. It was something she had not fully encountered before, a man who could hold both of those ideas at once without needing to collapse one into the other. She thought it was part of why she was going to marry him. "Both things can be true," she agreed. Garrett Peel came to the store one more time in April, and this time Lionel happened to be there, not by arrangement, but simply because it was a Saturday, and Saturday was when he came. Peel walked in and saw Lionel at the counter, and took in the picture of the two of them, the casual closeness that had become their natural state, and something in his expression recalibrated. He bought a box of matches and left without saying anything pointed, and that, it turned out, was the end of it. He settled his account the following month and began buying his supplies from the general store in the next town, which was 20 miles further but apparently more compatible with his pride. Nora was not sorry to see him go and not entirely surprised at what had moved him along, and she thought about both of those things with the complexity they deserved. April brought everything back. The grass on the prairie came up with the urgency of something that had been waiting all winter, and the creek ran high and clear, and Lionel's fence was finished, which he told her about with the quiet satisfaction of a man describing a thing he had built with his own hands, and his own time over many months of sustained effort. He had cattle now, 20 head that he had bought in March from a man in Dodge City, and Prospector had appointed himself their supervisor, which the cattle found irritating and Lionel found endearing. He asked her to come and see the property one Sunday afternoon in April, with the proper accompaniment of Mrs. Hattie Briggs, who was the widow of the Methodist minister and who served as the county's most reliable chaperone for unmarried couples of respectable intent, and who was also, Nora suspected, deeply curious about the Whitfield land. They drove out in Lionel's wagon on a Sunday afternoon of exceptional beauty, the sky the particular blue that Kansas produced in April as though making amends for January, and the grass on both sides of the road showing every shade between yellow and green. Mrs. Briggs sat between them on the wagon seat with the satisfied air of a woman doing her civic duty pleasantly. The property was beautiful. Nora had known it would be, from his descriptions, but descriptions are always incomplete. The land rolled gently around the creek, which sparkled with the frivolous brilliance of April water, and the fence Lionel had built ran straight and true along the north and east quarters, and the cattle moved among the new grass with the relaxed authority of animals who have found a good place. The house was still rough in places, though the porch had been rebuilt by Ezra Marsh and was solid and wide, and the kitchen ceiling had been repaired, and there were curtains in the windows that she guessed he had ordered from the catalog in Wichita, plain muslin ones that were perfectly functional and almost comically at odds with the evident care he had given to every structural element. "The curtains are terrible," she said. "I know," he said. "I do not have a good eye for that kind of thing." "I could help with that," she said, and then felt Mrs. Briggs's interested attention sharpen beside her, and added, "At some point." "At some point," Lionel agreed, with the small smile she had come to consider one of her favorite things in the world. He showed her the house, and she moved through it with the particular attention of a woman who is measuring a thing against a future that has not yet arrived but is becoming clearer with every room. The main room was good, with a proper fireplace and enough space for a table and chairs and a comfortable life. The bedroom was simple. There was a second room that he had been using for storage. "That room could be anything," he said, watching her look at it. "A study," she said, "with bookshelves." "That is exactly what I thought," he said. Mrs. Briggs, from the doorway, made a sound that might have been approval. They went back to town in the late afternoon, with the sun behind them and the road golden in front, and Mrs. Briggs talked the whole way about the property, and how well it had come along, and how she remembered when the Whitfields had it, and how different it looked now, which Nora understood was her generous way of saying she approved of everything she had seen without saying it directly. He asked her in May. It was a Saturday evening, and she had made dinner in the back room of the store, which she had done several times by this point. A simple meal because she was not a demonstrative cook, though she was a competent one, and they had eaten and talked, and the conversation had been easy and wide-ranging, touching on a letter from his uncle, and on a delivery she was expecting from Wichita, and on a book they were both reading, which was a collection of natural history essays that had come in with a shipment of goods from an estate sale in Abilene. He got up from the table and then, instead of going to the door, he crouched down on one knee, and she looked at him and felt the particular quality of a moment that you know will stay with you, its edges sharp and clear. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have been thinking about how to do this properly for 3 months, and I have not been able to improve on the direct approach." He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a ring, a gold band with a small dark red garnet set in it, simple and lovely. "I chose the garnet because the jeweler in Wichita told me it was the color of certainty, and I like that. I am certain about you, Nora. I want to make a life with you, and I want it to start as soon as possible." She slid off her chair and crouched in front of him so they were at the same level, because she did not want him on his knee when she answered him. She wanted them face to face. "Yes," she said. "I told you in January the answer would be yes, and it still is. Yes." He put the ring on her finger, and then she was in his arms, and the store was very quiet around them. And outside, the May evening was doing its best work with the last light of the day. They were married in June. The wedding was at the Methodist church, performed by the new minister who had come in the spring, a Reverend McAllister, who was young and earnest and slightly terrified of his new congregation, and who got through the ceremony with more grace than Nora had expected. She wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that her sister in St. Louis had sent out as a wedding gift, along with a note that said she was glad Nora had found someone worth keeping, and that she expected photographs as soon as the town had a photographer, which it did not yet but would eventually. Mrs. Briggs sat in the front row and cried in the contained and satisfied way of a woman who has helped a thing along. Tom Reardon, the livery man, sat in the second row and looked on with the expression of a man who had known this was coming, since he told two strangers about each other in the autumn. Lionel's voice was steady when he said his vows, and when he looked at her, it was with the complete and unperformed attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, and she thought that what she was gaining was not just a husband but a witness, someone who would pay attention to the life she lived, and whom she would pay the same attention to in return. She said her vows clearly and without hesitation. They drove out to the property afterward in a wagon that Tom Reardon had decorated with ribbons, which Prospector inspected with deep suspicion from the wagon bed. The afternoon was warm and the sky was the particular June blue that is almost painful in its beauty, and the grass on the Holloway land was fully green and the cattle were peaceable, and the house had a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen table that Lionel had put there that morning, which made her love him immediately and completely in a new specific way. "I put those there myself," he said. "It took me longer to find them than I expected." "They are perfect," she said. "They are slightly wilted," he said. "They are perfect," she said again. They ate supper on the wide porch that Ezra Marsh had built, and the evening came on slowly the way June evenings do in Kansas, with gradual and generous light, and Prospector lay between them on the porch boards and sighed with contentment, and the cattle made their distant evening sounds across the field, and Nora sat beside her husband, and thought that this was what the word home meant when it was at its most accurate. Summer moved through the land with the unhurried confidence of a season that knows it owns the place. The store did its good summer business, and Nora ran it with her usual precision, and Lionel worked the property and came to town on Saturdays and sometimes on weekday evenings when the work allowed it, and they settled into the overlapping rhythm of two lives finding their common time. She had not given up the store, as she had told him she would not. It remained hers entirely, and she ran it entirely, and he understood this without having to be told, because he had understood it from the beginning. What changed was that she had somewhere to go that was not the back room of the store, somewhere that was land and air and specific. And what changed for him was that the house had a person in it who brought books and her own clear handwriting and a way of looking at things that he had been, he later told her, writing her name in the margins for. "Tell me when you started doing that," she said. One August evening on the porch, Prospector between them, the last of the summer light doing what it did. "The first supply list," he said. She turned to look at him. "The very first. I did not notice I was doing it until I had already done it," he said. "I was writing out the list and you were moving around the store and I was watching you and I was writing your name. I noticed when I gave you the list and then I thought that I should perhaps take it back and start over, but you had already started reading it and the name was in the margins and not in the list, so I thought you might not notice." "I noticed immediately," she said. He looked at her. "You did not say anything." "I was still deciding what to do about it," she said. "And what did you decide?" She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, warm and certain. "I kept the list," she said. "It is on the shelf with the books." He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and the evening came down over the Kansas prairie with all its broad and beautiful indifference, and she thought that she had been right in everything she had told herself in the autumn, that this was the best kind of being known, by someone who had been writing your name before he had thought about why. By September, Nora knew she was pregnant. She had known it with the body's own practical knowledge before she let herself fully think it, in the way of women who have lived closely enough with physical reality to read its signals accurately. She told Lionel on a Sunday morning in late September, in the kitchen of the property house, where she was spending more and more of her time, though she kept her rooms above the store for the days when closing at 6 made more sense than the drive home. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, which was something like amazement, the specific kind that is not surprised but is overwhelmed. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. "March or April, I think." He got up from the table and came to her and held her with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she could feel the breath he let out, long and slow, as though he had been holding it without knowing. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "It is early yet, but I feel fine." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and whatever he found there seemed to confirm what she had said. "You are going to be extraordinary at this," he said. "We are going to be ordinary at it," she said. "Which is better? Extraordinary parents produce anxious children." He laughed and held her again, and Prospector, who was deeply suspicious of any extended human embrace on the grounds that it generally excluded him, pressed his nose between them with urgent authority. She told her sister in St. Louis in a letter that she wrote that evening at the kitchen table, in her own clear hand, and felt the pleasure of writing good news across a distance, the sense that the letter would arrive in St. Louis and her sister would open it, and the good thing would happen twice. The autumn of 1879 was a good one for Caldwell County. The cattle drives had brought money into the town, and the railroad had taken enough of it away to keep the balance functional, and the store did its best business of the 3 years Nora had owned it. She managed the long days with the same efficiency she had always brought to the work, making adjustments as her body asked for them, without making more of it than was warranted. Lionel came to town more frequently, and she suspected this was related to the pregnancy, though he never said so directly, and she let him do it because his presence was not an imposition. He sat at the end of the counter on a wooden stool he had started keeping there and read or mended something, or simply kept her company in the way he had always kept it, attentive and undemanding, and customers got used to seeing him there, and some of them found it charming, and some of them found it unusual, and all of them eventually found it unremarkable, which was the best outcome. There was a young woman who worked part-time in the store now, a 15-year-old named Rose Tillman, whose family had come to the county that spring. Rose was quick and willing and good with customers, and Nora had been teaching her to keep the basic accounts, both because it was useful and because she had learned from her own life that a woman who understood numbers had a kind of security that other things could not easily remove. Rose noticed Lionel's presence at the counter, and one afternoon, when he had stepped out to check on his wagon, she said to Nora, "He watches you all the time." "Does he?" Nora said. "Not in a strange way," Rose said quickly. It is like how Prospector watches him, just making sure everything is all right." Nora thought about that image, the dog and the man, both of them paying attention to their person with the uncomplicated fidelity of creatures who know where they belong. "That is a very accurate description," she said. The winter came on, and Nora moved through it with the adjusted pace that the pregnancy required, keeping the store running with Rose's help and spending her evenings at the property house with Lionel, who had insulated the back room and put in a better stove, and built the bookshelves she had identified on her first visit. The shelves were full now, a mix of her books and the ones he had read and kept, and the inventory list with her name in every margin had been moved from the shelf in the store to the bookshelf here, framed between 2 books she thought of as theirs, the natural history essays they had both been reading when he proposed, and a volume of poems that had been a wedding gift from Mrs. Briggs. She wrote in the journal he had given her the previous Christmas. She wrote observations and thoughts and small careful records of things she wanted to remember, the quality of light in particular moments, the way the snow fell differently over the open prairie than it had over the city, the specific sound of Lionel's voice when he was thinking something through aloud, which was different from his voice when he had already thought it through. She wrote what she wanted to tell their child someday, not in a formal way, but in the way you write things for yourself when you know they might be read. He read over her shoulder one evening unintentionally, and she closed the journal not from embarrassment but from the instinct to finish the thought before sharing it. "What were you writing?" he asked. "Things I want to remember," she said. "Tell me one." She thought about it. "That you wrote my name in every margin before you had a reason to," she said. "I want to remember that first." He was quiet for a moment. "I will tell you something," he said. "I did not tell you before because I was not sure how to say it." He paused. "When I was writing those supply lists, when I first came to the store, I did not have anyone I was writing to. My uncle and I wrote to each other, but it was infrequent and I was not writing to anyone else, and I had been like that for a long time. And then you read my handwriting. No one could ever read my handwriting. And I thought, this is a woman who can understand something everyone else finds impossible. And I started writing your name without knowing I was doing it because something in me was already." He stopped. "Already what?" she said. "Already home," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married, this man who had written her name in every margin before he knew why. And she thought that some things were too large for immediate response, and that the right answer to them was simply to be fully present to them, which she was. She reached over and took his hand. They sat there in the lamplight with the winter outside and the books around them and the small certainty of the child coming in the spring, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a life went right. The baby came in March. He came fast and determined, as though he had made up his mind about the direction and was not interested in delay, and Nora worked through it with the help of Mrs. Briggs, who had experience in these matters, and the county doctor, a man named Aldred who was competent and kind, and Lionel, who was told by Mrs. Briggs to stay in the kitchen and who stayed there with Prospector, and worked through an entire pot of coffee, and most of his composure before the sound of a baby crying resolved the long waiting. He was allowed in shortly after, and he came to the bed where Nora was sitting with the baby, and she held the child out to him and watched his face do the thing that it had done when she told him she was pregnant, that specific amazement. And then he held his son, and the amazement became something quieter and more permanent, as though a door had been opened that would always be open now. "He looks like you," Nora said. "He looks like a baby," Lionel said. "They all look like babies." "He has your nose already," she said. "His nose is the size of my thumbnail," Lionel said. "How can you tell?" "The angle of it," she said. "It will be your nose, I am confident." He sat on the edge of the bed and held his son with the careful fullness of a man who is taking something seriously with his whole body, and she leaned against his shoulder, tired and satisfied and awake in the particular way of a new mother who has crossed a threshold and can feel the new country beginning. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names and had a list but had not decided. "William," Lionel said. "For my uncle." "William," she said, testing it. "William Holloway." "Unless you object," he said. "I do not object," she said. "Your uncle would be pleased." "He will be," Lionel said. "I will write to him tomorrow." "I will write the letter," she said. "Your handwriting frightens him on good days. This news deserves legibility." He laughed quietly, and William Holloway, 2 hours old and already under the impression that the world was reasonable, opened his eyes briefly and seemed to consider things before closing them again. Spring opened out around them in the weeks that followed, enormous and generous, the prairie doing what it did with every April, which was to remind everyone that the winter had been a temporary condition, and that the world was, in fact, mostly grass and sky and possibility. Nora recovered with the practical determination of a woman with a business to run and a child to raise and a husband to love, and she was back at the store within 3 weeks with Rose Tillman managing the counter capably and William in a cradle behind it. Lionel came to town most days now, not out of concern, but because the farm work had its own rhythm and the mornings were often free, and the store was where she was. He would come in and get his coffee and sit with William for an hour, and then go back to the property. And Nora thought that the particular image of him holding his son while Prospector made careful inspection of the cradle from nearby was something she would keep in her mind, with the specific attention of someone who knows they are in a moment worth keeping. The first letter Lionel's uncle sent after William's birth was addressed to William Holloway directly, and it was written in the familiar impossible script, and Nora read it aloud to William, who was 4 months old and not yet particularly conversant, but who seemed to enjoy the sound. The letter told William that he had good parents and a good place to grow up, and that his great-uncle in Nashville sent his love and a pressed flower from the family garden, which was tucked inside the envelope, dried and fragile and achingly sweet. She wrote back on William's behalf, which became their tradition, the uncle's letters addressed to William and answered by Nora in her clear hand, narrating the growing stages of his great-nephew's life with the specificity she had always brought to letters, the weight of him and the first time he laughed, and the color of his eyes, which turned out to be the same dark honey color as hers, and not Lionel's gray-green as they had initially suspected. Summer came and went and came again, and with it the accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary days that constituted a life. William learned to sit, and then to stand, and then to walk with the wobbling determination of a creature newly committed to vertical existence. The store expanded slightly, Nora having negotiated the lease on the building next door, and knocked through a doorway to create a second room where she sold fabric and notions and things of that nature, which turned out to be a significant expansion of her customer base. Lionel added to the herd, bought a second horse, rebuilt the barn with a new hayloft that he and Ezra Marsh built together over 2 weeks in the fall, and became, in the estimation of the county, a solid and reliable man of the land, which he was. He was also known, more quietly, as the man who sat at the end of the counter at Alden's general store most mornings and occasionally read paragraphs aloud from whatever book he was working through, and whose handwriting remained the most extraordinary illegible document in the county, and whose wife was the only person who could read it. This last fact became useful in ways that Nora had not anticipated. It began the second autumn when a man came to the store asking for help. His name was Daniel Crow, and he was one of 3 Osage men who had taken up farming on the eastern edge of the county, having been, as Nora understood it, among those dispossessed of far more through the systematic treaty violations and land seizures that had characterized the government's relationship with the Osage people. Violations that she thought about with a specific and uncomfortable honesty whenever she considered the fact that her own store sat on land that had once belonged to no single person and therefore, by the law that was not always just, to the government that had taken it. Daniel Crow had received a letter from a government land office in Topeka, written in bureaucratic language, and with the additional difficulty of having been composed by a clerk whose handwriting was, apparently, a close cousin to Lionel's. He had been told by 3 different people in town that Nora Alden could read impossible handwriting, and he had come to her. She read the letter carefully and translated it into plain language. There was a question about the land registration for the eastern parcel, and the office needed a specific document filed before a deadline that was 6 weeks away, and the penalty for not filing was the loss of the claim. She looked up from the letter and met Daniel Crow's steady gaze. "I can help you write the response," she said, "and I know the general process for land filing because I went through it myself when I bought this property. The clerk in Topeka is sometimes difficult, but he can be reasoned with." He looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man deciding whether to trust, which she thought was entirely reasonable given the history he had with government offices and the people who worked in them. "I would appreciate that," he said. "Come back on Saturday," she said. "My husband knows more about the land registration requirements than I do. We will both help you." She told Lionel that evening, and he listened and said yes without hesitation. and on Saturday the three of them sat at her accounting table and worked through the filing requirements together. Lionel explaining the practical land law he had learned through his own registration process, and Nora writing the response letter in her clearest and most authoritative hand. She addressed it to the specific clerk by name, which she had gotten from the letter, and she wrote with the precision of someone who understood that language was also a kind of protection. The filing was accepted. Daniel Crow came back to the store the following month with a sack of dried corn from his autumn harvest and a look of gratitude that was quiet and specific and real. "Thank you," he said, "both of you. It should not have needed doing," Nora said carefully, meaning the whole situation, the difficulty, the requirement that a man prove his right to the land he farmed through paperwork drafted in a language designed to confuse and exclude. Daniel Crow looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it should not have. But you helped when you could have not helped, and that is not nothing." She thought about that for a long time after. It was not enough, she knew. The systems that had taken the Osage land and the Comanche Range and the Apache Territory and everything else were not corrected by one letter to a Topeka clerk. But Daniel Crow was right that not nothing was still something, and she thought that a life spent doing what she could with what she had was not a bad way to occupy the years. She wrote about it in her journal that evening, while Lionel put William to bed, which he did with the ceremony of a man who takes bedtime rituals seriously, involving at minimum one story and often two. She wrote about Daniel Crow and about the letter, and about the injustice underneath the practicality of what they had done, and she wrote that she wanted William to understand both things, the importance of what you could do and the acknowledgement of what was wrong, because she thought they were the same lesson approached from different directions. Lionel came out of William's room with the quiet step of a man who has successfully navigated the fine line between sufficient story and excessive story, and he sat beside her at the kitchen table and looked at what she was writing. "Can I read it?" he asked. She pushed the journal toward him and he read slowly in the way he always read her writing, as though each sentence were worth the full attention of a sentence. "You should teach," he said when he finished. She looked at him. "Teach. There is no school in this county," he said. "There has not been since Mrs. Fowler left for Wichita. There are children who are not being educated." He paused. "You know more than almost anyone I have met. You read everything. You taught Rose Tillman to keep accounts. He gestured at the journal. "You write like this." "I have a store to run," she said. "You could do both," he said. "Rose is capable now. The store almost runs itself on the quiet days." She looked at him. She looked at the journal. She looked at the lamp on the table between them, the same lamp that had been between them on every Saturday evening since the first one when she had written his uncle's letter, a lamp that had seen more of their lives than almost any other object. "Let me think about it," she said. She thought about it for a month and then she started a school. It was not a school building at first. It was the second room of the expanded store, 3 mornings a week, with 8 children whose parents were grateful and whose enthusiasm was variable. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic and some geography and history, and she ran it alongside the store with Rose Tillman managing the front room during school hours. The county, which had been slowly becoming aware that it needed a school and had been avoiding the expense of building one, responded to this development with the combination of relief and guilt that characterized its relationship with civic responsibility. By the spring of 1881, the county had committed funds for a school building, which was built on the lot adjacent to the church, and was a small but proper structure with desks and a blackboard and a stove and a dedicated teacher, who was the only person in the county with the evident qualifications for the post. Nora said yes to the teaching position on the condition that Rose Tillman was formally employed as the store's manager, which Rose received with a composure that barely concealed her joy, and the store continued its good business under Rose's capable management, while Nora taught the county's children in the mornings and kept the store's books in the evenings. William, who was two that spring, had strong opinions about the schoolroom, which he associated with his mother, and therefore considered his by extension, and Lionel had to exercise considerable diplomatic skill to prevent him from simply attending whenever he felt like it. "He is your son," Nora said, watching Lionel reason with William on the subject of personal jurisdiction over public institutions. "He is your son in this respect," Lionel said. "This is entirely your influence." "I consider that a compliment," she said. William grew, and the county grew, and the store grew, and the school grew, and the life they were building expanded in all the ways that good lives do when the foundation is solid. By 1882, they had added a room to the house, which gave William his own bedroom and freed the second room to serve as the study she had identified on her first visit, with the bookshelves now properly full and the small writing desk where she kept her papers and her journal. The desk had a surface that she had let Lionel use when he needed to write his letters, which he did under her benign supervision, and he still wrote in his extraordinary hand that she could read as easily now as she read print, and the letters still went to his uncle in Nashville, and his uncle still wrote back in his own dramatic script, and Nora still read them aloud to William, who was now old enough to sit still and listen and ask questions that were sometimes very difficult to answer. "Why does great-uncle William live so far away?" William asked on one of these evenings when he was nearly 4 and possessed of the philosophical appetite of a child who has discovered that questions can open things. "Because he was born there and grew up there," Nora said. "Your father grew up there too." "Why did Papa come here?" Lionel, from across the room where he was pretending to read but was actually listening, said. "I came here to find something." William considered this. "Did you find it?" "Yes," Lionel said. "What was it?" Nora looked at Lionel. Lionel looked at Nora. There was between them the particular exchange of two people who have been in each other's company long enough to have a whole conversation in a look. "Home," Lionel said, as he had said to her once in the lamplight of the kitchen. William appeared to find this answer satisfactory, because he returned to the letter and asked what a pressed flower was and whether he could plant it, and Nora had to explain gently about dried flowers and preservation, and the question of what could and could not be brought back to life, which opened a conversation that lasted another half-hour and ranged across gardening and death and seeds and winter, all the connected things, and she thought later that this was what teaching was. Whether you were in a schoolroom or a kitchen, the willingness to follow a question wherever it went. The second baby came in the fall of 1883, a girl this time, born on an October afternoon when the trees along Brennan Creek were at their most extravagant color, and Nora felt the October light through the window of the bedroom and thought it was a good day to be born on. They named her Anna, which had been Nora's mother's name, and she was small and loud, and William regarded her with the intense suspicion of a firstborn child confronting the reality of a sibling, which gradually, and then suddenly transformed into a fierce protectiveness that Nora recognized as love in the form it takes before children have words for it. Lionel held Anna with the same careful amazement he had brought to holding William, and she looked at him holding this small, loud daughter and thought that she would put this in the journal too, this specific picture, so that she would always be able to find it. The county was changing in these years. The cattle drives were slowing as the railheads moved and the ranges were fenced, and the wide-open West was becoming, in steady increments, a more organized and less romantic place. Some of the old cowboys who had passed through Caldwell Crossing on those drives had moved on or settled or died, and new people were coming in from the East and from overseas, bringing different languages and different expectations, and the general disruption of a world in transition. Nora's school grew with the growing county. By 1884, she had 22 students and a part-time assistant, and she had taught herself enough Spanish to communicate with the families of the Mexican cattlemen who had settled on the south edge of the county, which she thought was both practically important and the least she could do given that they were expected to navigate a world that conducted itself primarily in English. Lionel's herd had grown to 100 head, and he had hired a hand, a steady young man named Fletcher who had come up from Texas, and who took his work seriously and his evenings quietly, which were qualities Lionel valued in an employee. The property was a proper working farm now, the fence entire and sound, the barn solid, the house finished in all the ways that a house becomes finished only over years, each room acquiring its character gradually through use and time. One evening in the spring of 1885, Nora was in the study going over her school papers when Lionel came in and sat in the chair across from her desk. She looked up at him. He had the expression he got when he was carrying something he was about to put down. "I have been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "My uncle is not well," he said. "He wrote in the last letter, you read it, the knee has become worse and his housekeeper has left and he is alone in the house." "I know," she said. She had been thinking about it since she had read the letter 2 weeks ago. "I would like to go to Nashville," he said, "to see him. I have not seen him in 7 years." "We should go," she said. He looked at her. "You would come." "He is family," she said. "And William is old enough for the journey. Anna is small, but she is sturdy." She paused. "And I have never been to Tennessee." "The school," he said. "My assistant can manage for a month," she said. "The county board will understand, and if they do not, I will explain it to them." He smiled, the full smile she had been receiving for 7 years now and still regarded as one of the best sights available to her. "You would explain it to them?" "Without difficulty," she said. They went to Nashville in the early summer of 1885, the 4 of them plus Prospector, who was old now and moved more slowly but retained his fundamental conviction that where Lionel went, he went. The journey took 12 days by train, which was remarkable to Nora in the way that trains always were, the speed of it, the country unrolling outside the window at a rate the body could not quite believe. Nashville was green in a way Kansas was not, humid and close and full of trees that had been growing for 100 years and were not shy about it. William pressed his face against the window of the carriage and asked questions about everything, and Anna slept through her homecoming to a place she had never been. William Holloway, the uncle, was in his early 60s now, slower than he had been and with a knee that genuinely troubled him, but his mind was sharp and his spirit was intact, and when he saw his nephew come through the door, he wept without embarrassment and embraced him for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to Nora, and she saw in his face the features she had been reading about for 7 years, the family resemblance to Lionel that was there in the width of the brow and the quality of the attention. "You are the woman who could read both our handwriting," he said. "I am," she said. "I have been wanting to meet you since the first letter you wrote me," he said. "You described a sunset in Kansas that I have been seeing in my mind ever since." She took his hand and shook it, and then, because he seemed like the kind of man who understood what the gesture meant, she kept holding it for a moment. "Your letters have kept us connected," she said. "Thank you for writing them." They stayed 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks Nora came to know the elder William Holloway in the way that you know someone when you are in their house, and at their table, and in their company for the long, ordinary hours of consecutive days. He was a man of wit and warmth, and the particular dignity of someone who has made peace with what his life had been and was. He told her stories about Lionel as a boy that she recorded in her mind with great care, the quiet, serious child who wrote his own name in that extraordinary hand from the very beginning, who had brought home stray animals and wounded birds, and once a small fox that his grandmother had permitted him to keep for a week before it became ungovernable. He took to William and Anna with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a man who has no grandchildren of his own, and who understands, at 60, the specific grace of children. He read to William from his own library, which was enormous and dusty and wonderful, and he let Anna sit on his knee while he talked, and she seemed to regard him as an entirely acceptable person, which, coming from Anna, who had strong views, was significant. On the evening before they left, Nora sat with the elder William on his porch while Lionel put the children to bed, and they talked in the companionable way of two people who have become friends through letters and have now confirmed it in person. "He was lost for a long time," the elder William said. "After Catherine, after Tennessee. He wrote to me from every cattle town between Texas and Kansas, and the letters were not unhappy exactly, but empty, like he was writing from a place that was not yet anywhere. And now," she said, the old man smiled. "Now his letters are full," he said, "full of land and cattle and weather and children, and you are in every letter, not always by name, sometimes just in the way he describes things, like a man who is seeing things with two pairs of eyes." She thought of the inventory list with her name in every margin. She thought of the way he had described it already home before he knew why. "He is the best person I know," she said. "He is," the old man agreed simply. They came home to Kansas in late July, sun-brown and full of stories and Tennessee humidity still faintly in their clothes. And the drive from the Caldwell Crossing station to the property on the Brennan Creek Road was the drive she knew better than any road she had ever traveled. And the house at the end of it was her house, exactly as she had left it and exactly as right. William ran immediately to the barn to confirm that the cattle had been properly supervised in his absence, a task he took very seriously at the age of 6, and Anna fell asleep on Lionel's shoulder before they had fully stopped the wagon, and Prospector made his slow and thorough investigation of the porch to ensure that nothing unacceptable had occurred in their absence. Nora stood in the yard of her home and looked at the evening sky over the Kansas prairie, which was doing exactly what Lionel had described in the letter she had written to his uncle 7 years ago: extraordinary, broad, uninterrupted, a sky that required the full capacity of your attention to take it in. Lionel came to stand beside her, Anna still on his shoulder, asleep with the absolute conviction of a child who has decided this particular shoulder is where she belongs. "Glad to be home?" he asked. "I was glad in Tennessee," she said. "I am more glad here." He put his free arm around her and she leaned against him, and thought that the years since October 1878 had been the education she had come to Kansas to receive, and the lesson was not the one she had expected, but was the one she needed. She had thought she was coming to build something with her own hands. She had done that. She had also found in the margins of a supply list the person who would write her name in every available space, not to possess it but to return to it, to orient by it, to say, "Here is what I am thinking about when I am supposed to be thinking about something else." She put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and familiar, the particular rhythm she had fallen asleep to and woken to for 7 years. "I have something to tell you," she said. He went still in the way he went still when something significant was approaching. "Tell me." "I believe we are going to have another child," she said. "In the spring again, I think. March, perhaps." The arm around her tightened. Anna stirred slightly and resettled. "Are you sure?" he asked. "As sure as I was the other 2 times," she said. "I know the feeling now." He turned and kissed her temple and then her cheek, and she heard him take a breath and let it out with that same long slowness of the first time, the breath of a man who is receiving something larger than expected. "What shall we do with a third?" he asked. "Love them," she said. "Same as we did with the first 2. William came back from the barn at a run, full of news about the cattle and the hayloft and something Fletcher had built. And the evening came around them all, and the prairie went gold, and then dark, and the stars came out over Kansas in the profligate way they did, as though the sky could not help itself. And Nora stood in the yard of her home with her husband and her children and her life, and felt the deep-rooted satisfaction of a woman who has built exactly what she meant to build and received. Along the way, what she had not known to ask for. The third baby came the following March, a boy they named Thomas after Nora's father, who had died the previous year in St. Louis, and whose careful physician's handwriting she still read in her memory when she thought of him, the man who had given her the early education in understanding what other people could not. Thomas was healthy and loud and looked, immediately and unmistakably, like his father, with Lionel's jaw and Lionel's hands in miniature. which she pointed out, and which Lionel denied with the laughing self-deprecation of a man who knows he is exactly right. Anna, at 2, was uncertain about Thomas for approximately 1 week, and then appointed herself his primary protector, which she remained, with great dedication and occasional tyranny, for the rest of his childhood. William, at 7, received Thomas with the magnanimity of the eldest, which meant he examined him carefully, declared him acceptable, and then went back to what he had been doing, which was building a dam in the creek. Life on the Holloway property in the years that followed was the accumulated ordinary and particular days of a family that had found its shape. The school continued, and Nora taught it with the dedication and curiosity she brought to everything, watching her students learn to read and write and reckon and think, watching them become people. Rose Tillman married Ezra Marsh's apprentice, and continued to run the store with a capable independence that Nora took as confirmation of everything she had always believed about the importance of teaching women to handle their own numbers. Lionel wrote his supply lists and his letters, and his occasional notes to Nora in the extraordinary hand that remained magnificently unique, and she read them all without difficulty, had read them without difficulty for so long now, that she could not entirely remember the time when his handwriting had seemed like a puzzle rather than a language she was fluent in. The inventory list with her name in every margin was still on the bookshelf in the study, between the natural history essays and the volume of Mrs. Briggs's poetry. She had looked at it so many times that she no longer needed to look at it, though she did sometimes, taking it from the shelf on a quiet afternoon and sitting with it, and tracing the shapes of her own name in his hand, the loops and angles that were entirely him, the particular system she had been the first to recognize as a system. William was 11 when he found it on the shelf and took it down and looked at it with the focused frown of a child confronting a puzzle. "What is this?" he asked. "A list your father wrote when he first came to Caldwell Crossing," she said. "It has your name all around the edges," William said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She thought about how to explain it to an 11-year-old, the thing that had not been explicable even to the two people it was happening to at the time. "Your father was thinking about me before he knew why," she said. "The margins were where he put the things he was thinking about." William looked at this for a long moment with the expression he got when he was working through something. "Did you keep it because it was important?" "I kept it because it was the first proof," she said. "Proof of what?" She reached over and took the paper gently from him and turned it over in her hands. The ink was slightly faded after 10 years, but the handwriting was the same, large and angular and entirely itself. Her name repeated in every available space around the edges of a supply list for flour and salt pork and coffee and nails and lamp oil and fence wire. That the person who is going to matter to you most will show up before you have organized your reasons, she said. And sometimes they will be writing your name in the margins while they are still trying to figure out why. William considered this with the gravity of an 11-year-old confronting a large idea. "That is very strange," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It is also exactly right." She put the paper back between its books. That evening, with the children put to bed in various stages of resistance and Prospector old and white-muzzled and sleeping deeply on the rug in front of the fire, he had lived to a remarkable age and showed no signs of considering the alternative. She sat at the study desk and wrote in her journal, which was the third one now, the first two full and kept on the shelf alongside everything else. She wrote about the inventory list and about William's question and about the answer she had given, which she thought was as true as she had been able to make it. She wrote about the particular quality of the evening, the children's voices fading and then silent, the fire's sound, the way the lamplight fell across the desk in the same way it had fallen in that back room of the store in the first winter they had talked, when she had written out his uncle's dictated letter, and he had stayed an hour past when he meant to leave. She wrote, "I came to Kansas to build something. I built a store and a school and a life." But the thing I built that I did not plan was a partnership with a man whose handwriting I was the only one who could read, who had been writing my name in the margins before he had his reasons. The reasons came. They are still coming. They fill every margin I have. Lionel appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, the nightly ritual of their evenings, and he held one out to her and looked over her shoulder at what she was writing. She did not close the journal this time. He read the last paragraph slowly in his careful way, and when he finished he set the coffee cup on the edge of the desk and put his hand on her shoulder, warm and certain. "You write about me better than I write about anything," he said. "You write about me in every margin," she said. "That is its own form of eloquence." He pulled the other chair around to her side of the desk, the way he had done 100 evenings now, and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they drank their coffee in the lamplight with the fire and the sleeping dog and the quiet house around them. Outside, the Kansas prairie was doing what it always did at night, which was to make the sky enormous and fill it with more stars than any reasonable sky required. Stars that had been there long before cattle drives or railroads or general stores or schoolrooms or love letters written in impossible handwriting, and would be there long after, indifferent and brilliant and constant. But here in this room, in this lamplight, with this man whose name she wrote in her journal, and whose handwriting she had understood from the first day, here was not indifferent. Here was the opposite. Here was every margin filled, every available space claimed, every blank edge written over with the evidence of attention. He took her hand, as he had taken it across that accounting table on the first evening she had offered it, and she turned her palm to meet his, as she had done then too, and they sat together in the warmth of what they had made and what they were still making, which was not finished and would not be for a long time, and which was, in every particular, enough. In the morning there would be children to feed, and a school to open and a store to check in on, and cattle to tend, and a letter to write to Nashville where the elder William Holloway, who had lived to see his nephew happy, would receive it in his house surrounded by the family's books, and read it slowly in the light of his Tennessee window, Nora's clear handwriting carrying the small particular news of the life on Brennan Creek, the new growth of spring, the children's latest occupations, the latest volume on the shelf. A sunset over the Kansas plain that she would describe so carefully he would see it with his eyes closed, the kind of description that only comes from a person who is fully, gratefully present in the place where she belongs, and in the margins of her letter, as she always did now, as she had been doing since she understood what it meant, she would write his name, Lionel. Not in every margin, perhaps, but in at least one, so that the letter would arrive in Nashville carrying the same evidence that had been there from the beginning. The name that belonged in the margins, the name that meant home, the name she had learned to read before she had learned to say it, in the autumn of 1878, when a man with impossible handwriting had walked into her store with a list, and she had been the only one who could read it. That was how it had begun. This was where it had gone. And every page between was written over, in both their hands, in every available margin, with the accumulated record of a life taken seriously and loved well.